The restaurant was glowing that evening. The lights were soft and golden, the sound of cutlery clinking against plates filled the air, and people whispered to each other, enjoying their fine meals. It was not just any restaurant, it was the kind of place where only the wealthy usually dined. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved around quietly, carrying trays with polished glasses and beautifully plated dishes. Among the guests that evening was a man who drew more attention than anyone else, the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the city. People noticed when he walked in. They whispered his name. He was a man of influence, and his presence made the place feel even more important. The CEO was seated with a few of his partners. Their table was near the corner, private but visible. They talked in low tones about business, sometimes laughing politely. Everyone else in the restaurant stole glances, impressed that such a powerful man was eating so close to them. Some even considered taking secret photos, just to prove they had seen him. Not far away, at a much smaller table, sat someone who did not belong to the world of wealth and power. He was a black single dad, dressed in a simple shirt, neat but not fancy. His shoes were polished, though slightly worn. Beside him sat his little daughter, her hair tied neatly with ribbons, her smile bright with excitement. This dinner was a special treat for her. He had saved money for weeks, cutting corners where he could, just to give her the experience of eating in a place like this. The girl's eyes sparkled as she looked at the menu, though she didn't recognize most of the dishes. "Daddy, can I have the one with the picture of pasta?" she asked. He smiled, nodding. "Yes, sweetheart. Tonight is your night." For him, it wasn't about the food. It was about giving his daughter a memory she would carry for years, a night where she felt special. Around them, other diners barely noticed the small family. Their attention remained fixed on the CEO. Even the staff focused more on that corner table, trying to impress the important man with extra care. But the single dad did not mind. He was used to being overlooked. His world revolved around his daughter, not recognition. As dishes arrived, laughter floated across the restaurant. The CEO raised his glass in a toast with his partners, speaking confidently about a new deal. His voice carried authority, the kind that made people fall silent without him asking. His presence filled the room. But at the single dad's table, a much softer voice filled the air, the voice of a father telling silly jokes, the sound of a little girl's laughter ringing louder than crystal glasses. Then something shifted. The door opened, and 3 men walked in. They didn't fit the polished scene. Their clothes were rough, their expressions sharp, their steps heavy with intention. The staff froze for a second. These were not ordinary customers. Their eyes scanned the room quickly, and in that brief moment, the single dad noticed the look. It wasn't random. They weren't here for food. They were here for someone. And then he saw it, their gaze locked straight onto the CEO's table. The CEO didn't notice at first. He was too busy talking. But the single dad's instincts immediately sharpened. His daughter was still laughing, playing with the fork in her tiny hands, unaware of the storm building around her. He gently placed a hand over hers, steadying her. She looked up, confused, but he smiled to calm her. "It's okay, baby," he whispered. Inside, though, his body was already alert. The waiters hesitated, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. A few guests noticed the 3 men too, and soft murmurs rippled through the room. But nobody dared to act. The air grew heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The single dad's eyes didn't leave the men. He studied how they walked, the way they carried their shoulders, the tension in their hands. He knew the signs. He had seen them before, in another life, a life he had buried when he chose to raise his daughter alone. The 3 men moved closer, their pace slow but steady. One of them adjusted his jacket in a way that made the single dad's pulse tighten. He had no doubt anymore. These men were not here by accident. The CEO was the target. And the danger was seconds away from breaking out. The single dad leaned toward his daughter again. "Stay close to me, all right," he said gently. She nodded, trusting him completely, though she still didn't understand. She picked up her juice with both hands and took a sip, her innocence untouched by the shadows creeping into the room. At the CEO's table, one of his partners finally noticed the approaching men. His eyes widened, but before he could say anything, the first shove came. The CEO was pushed back in his chair, caught off guard. The room gasped. Knives and forks froze midair. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. A woman at the next table let out a small scream. The CEO looked shocked, his authority useless against the raw aggression in front of him. His partners scrambled back, chairs screeching on the polished floor. The waiters stood frozen, clutching trays but unable to move. The three men loomed over the CEO, their voices rising, filled with anger. One grabbed him by the collar, shaking him. The entire restaurant was paralyzed, too afraid to step in. But at the small table in the corner, the single dad's eyes stayed calm, focused. His daughter tugged his sleeve nervously. "Daddy, what's happening?" she whispered again. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he scanned the space between the tables, the angle of the men, the distance to the CEO, the exits, and the reaction of the crowd. Every detail mattered. His mind was already calculating. He hadn't wanted this. He wanted only peace, a quiet night with his daughter. But he had learned long ago that life doesn't always give choices. Sometimes it demands action. And though no one in the room knew it yet, this ordinary-looking father carried a hidden skill that would change everything in the next few moments. The restaurant was no longer just a place of laughter and fine dining. It had turned into a stage where fear and courage would collide. And at the center of it, unnoticed until now, stood a man who had given up his past to build a new life yet could not escape the instinct that had once defined him. The CEO's chair screeched across the polished floor as the first man shoved him back, his expensive suit jacket wrinkling under the sudden grip of rough hands. Gasps rose all around the room. Forks clattered onto plates, and glasses were set down hastily. The sound of the restaurant changed in an instant. What had been warm and filled with quiet laughter now became frozen with tension. Guests looked at one another nervously, not sure what to do. The waiters stood stiff, caught between duty and fear, clutching their trays so tightly their knuckles turned white. The three men leaned over the CEO, their voices sharp and threatening. One of them hissed something close to his ear, while another slammed a hand on the table so hard that the cutlery jumped. The CEO's partners quickly stood, edging backward, wanting no part in the danger. One nearly stumbled over his chair in his rush to retreat. The CEO, usually calm and commanding in boardrooms, looked stunned and cornered. His confidence, built on years of power and wealth, seemed to shrink against the raw aggression surrounding him. The diners whispered, but no one dared to move. Some pulled out their phones, lifting them carefully to record what was happening. The glow of screens lit a few faces, their eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. But nobody stepped forward. Nobody tried to help. At the smaller table in the corner, the single dad kept his daughter close. She tugged at his sleeve again, her little voice trembling. "Daddy, why are they hurting him?" she asked, her eyes big with confusion. He looked at her and placed a gentle hand over hers. "Don't be scared," he whispered. He didn't give her the full truth, but inside he already knew how dangerous the situation was. His calmness wasn't born of ignorance. It came from experience he had kept hidden since the day he had promised himself to live a different life, a life built only for his daughter. His eyes locked on the three men. Every movement they made told him more. He studied the way their shoulders tensed, the twitch of their fingers, the weight in their stance. He could read their intentions like words on a page. The men were angry, reckless, but they weren't skilled. They were used to intimidation, not precision. That difference mattered. He breathed slowly, steadying himself. His daughter's safety came first, always, but he also knew that the room had reached a breaking point. One of the men raised his voice louder, grabbing the CEO's collar and shaking him. The CEO's face reddened, his composure slipping completely. The other diners began to murmur louder, some covering their mouths in shock. A woman whispered to her husband, "Why doesn't anyone do something?" But even he looked away, unwilling to step into the storm. The single dad leaned closer to his daughter. His voice dropped low, calm but firm. "Sweetheart, I need you to do something important for me," he said. Her small eyes searched his face, and she nodded quickly. "Go under the table and stay there until I tell you to come out. Do not move, no matter what you hear, okay?" She frowned, nervous, but she trusted him deeply. "Okay, Daddy," she whispered, and slid quietly under the table, hugging her knees. He gave her a reassuring smile before standing slowly. The chair scraped softly as he rose, but in the tense silence of the restaurant, even that sound seemed loud. A waiter saw him rise and quickly tried to stop him. "Sir, please don't. It's too dangerous," the waiter whispered urgently, his voice shaking. But the single dad only placed a calm hand on the waiter's shoulder and gave a small nod, as if to say, "Trust me." The three men noticed his movement immediately. They turned their heads, frowning at the figure now walking toward them. One of them barked, "Hey! Mind your own business." His tone was mocking, full of arrogance. The other two smirked, ready to laugh at the stranger's foolishness. But the single dad didn't answer. He kept walking, slow and steady, each step measured. His face was calm, his eyes sharp. There was no fear in his movements. The crowd noticed it too. A hush spread through the room. Diners stopped whispering. Even the phones lowered slightly. Everyone seemed to sense something different about this man. The CEO, caught in the middle of the chaos, blinked in confusion as he saw the stranger approaching. He couldn't understand why someone so ordinary-looking, someone dining with a little girl, would dare step into a situation that even grown men in expensive suits had run away from. But he couldn't look away either. The attackers grew restless as the single dad came closer. "We said back off," one of them snapped, shoving the CEO again to make their point. But the dad didn't flinch. His pace remained steady, his shoulders relaxed but firm. To anyone who didn't know, he might have looked reckless. But to those who were truly watching, his calmness carried something unusual, something unspoken. The restaurant was holding its breath. Glasses stood untouched. Plates of half-eaten meals went cold. The entire room felt suspended in the moment, waiting to see what would happen next. Some guests were silently praying, others were ready to run if things got worse. But nobody, not even the CEO, could predict what this quiet father was about to reveal. Inside his mind, the single dad was no longer in a restaurant. His senses shifted into the state he had once lived in long ago. He saw angles, openings, risks, and escape routes. He calculated time and space in fractions of a second. He remembered lessons drilled into him in long days of training, lessons that had never left him, even though he had buried that part of his life. He had promised himself he would never use those skills again unless there was no other choice. He had walked away from that world to build a new one for his daughter. But now, with her safety at stake and the lives of everyone in the restaurant hanging in the balance, he knew he could not remain seated. He had no choice but to step forward. The men thought they were in control. The CEO thought he was about to be humiliated. The guests thought they were about to witness violence they would never forget. But none of them knew that this ordinary-looking single dad carried a hidden power inside him. In just a few seconds, the balance of the room was going to change forever. The single dad stopped just a few feet away, his eyes locked on the men. His silence unnerved them. His stillness made them twitch. They could sense something, though they didn't understand it. The CEO swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the men and the stranger who now stood tall in the center of the room. The waiters clutched each other's sleeves, trembling. Guests leaned forward slightly, afraid yet unable to look away. The daughter, hidden under the table, squeezed her hands together, waiting for her father's voice. The room had become a stage where every person was a silent audience, watching as tension climbed to its peak. And then, just as one of the men sneered and raised his arm to strike, the single dad shifted his weight, ready to reveal the skill he had hidden from the world for so long. The second the single dad told his daughter to stay hidden under the table, something inside him shifted. His face still looked calm to the outside world, but his eyes sharpened, and his body grew more alert with every step he took toward the danger. He was no longer just a father in a restaurant. He was becoming the man he used to be, the man few people had ever truly seen. The attackers noticed his steady approach and grew irritated. They had not expected anyone to interfere. They thought the crowd would stay frozen, too afraid to act, and for the most part, they were right. Everyone else had stepped back, too stunned to move, too scared to help. But here was one man, not wealthy, not famous, walking toward them as if fear didn't exist. "Back off," one of the men barked, shoving the CEO again to make his point. The CEO tried to push his chair away, but another attacker blocked him, their hands gripping the backrest tightly. The CEO's usually confident voice cracked as he stammered, "What do you want? We can talk, just stop this." But the men only laughed, their voices rough and filled with anger. They weren't here to talk. They were here to humiliate, maybe worse. The single dad stopped just a few feet away. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke for the first time. "Enough." Just one word, but it carried weight. The restaurant fell even quieter, as if everyone was waiting for what would come next. The men laughed harder now, mocking him. "Or what? You think you're a hero," one said, stepping toward him. The other two snickered, confident in their numbers. They didn't see him as a threat. To them, he was just another diner, a man foolish enough to step into trouble that wasn't his. But the single dad didn't flinch. His body language was steady, his breathing even. He kept his hands loose at his sides, not clenched into fists, but ready. Those who knew about discipline would have noticed it. This was not the stance of someone reckless. This was the stance of someone trained, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The CEO's eyes darted between the attackers and the stranger. For the first time since the assault began, a glimmer of hope crossed his face. Something about the father's calmness told him this wasn't an ordinary man. Still, doubt filled him. Could this man really make a difference against three attackers? The first attacker stepped closer, pointing a finger at the single dad's chest. "This isn't your business. Sit down before we teach you a lesson." He pressed harder, expecting him to back away. But the dad didn't move. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked onto the man's. His silence made the attacker uneasy. The crowd noticed it too. There was something in that silence, something heavy, something powerful. At the table in the corner, the little girl peeked out from under the tablecloth. She saw her father standing tall, facing the men who frightened everyone else. She didn't understand what was happening fully, but she knew one thing: her father was not afraid. She hugged her knees tighter, waiting, trusting that he would protect her, just as he always did. The second attacker grew impatient. He shoved the CEO again, harder this time, trying to show control. "We don't have time for this," he muttered to his partners. Then he turned toward the father and spat, "Move, or you'll regret it." The single dad's voice was calm again. "You've done enough. Leave now." The room buzzed with nervous energy. Guests looked at each other with wide eyes. Some whispered, "He's crazy. He's going to get hurt. Others clutched their phones tighter, not sure whether to keep recording or drop them and run. The waiters hid behind the counter, peeking out, terrified but unable to look away. The first man finally snapped. He swung his arm suddenly, aiming a wild punch at the father. The crowd gasped. The CEO flinched in his chair. But what happened next shocked everyone. The father moved so quickly it seemed unreal. He sidestepped with precision, catching the attacker's wrist midair. With a swift twist, the man was forced off balance, stumbling forward. Before the crowd could even process what they had seen, the attacker was slammed against a nearby table, his arm pinned behind his back. Plates shattered, glasses rolled off the edge, and the man cried out in pain. Gasps filled the room. The second attacker charged forward, anger flashing across his face. But again, the father's movements were faster than anyone expected. With one sharp step and a controlled turn, he used the man's own momentum against him. In seconds, the second attacker was spun sideways, crashing against a chair, wind knocked out of him. The third attacker froze, his confidence shaken. He hadn't expected his partners to be on the ground so quickly. But pride and anger drove him forward anyway. He raised his fist, rushing toward the father. The single dad didn't hesitate. He ducked slightly, moved inside the man's swing, and pinned him with a precise grip. Within a heartbeat, the third attacker was on the floor, struggling but unable to rise. The entire restaurant erupted in gasps and stunned silence. It had taken just a few seconds. What everyone thought would be a dangerous brawl had ended almost before it began. Three men, full of aggression and arrogance, now lay groaning on the polished floor. And standing above them was the single dad, his breathing still calm, his posture controlled, his expression steady. The CEO stared in disbelief. His mind raced to catch up with what he had just witnessed. The man who saved him wasn't large or intimidating in appearance, but his movements had been flawless, fast, almost too quick for the eye to follow. He realized in that moment that this stranger had skills far beyond ordinary. The diners sat frozen, their hands over their mouths, their eyes wide. Some began whispering, others lowered their phones, realizing they had captured something unbelievable. The waiters stepped out slowly from their hiding spots, their jaws dropping as they looked at the three men on the ground. At the corner table, the little girl lifted the tablecloth and peeked again. When she saw her father standing tall, safe, and unhurt, a smile spread across her face. She crawled out from her hiding spot and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He bent down slightly, patting her back gently. "It's okay now," he whispered. The CEO finally found his voice. He stood slowly, straightening his wrinkled jacket. Who are you?" he asked, his voice still shaking. He couldn't understand how a man who looked so ordinary had ended the threat so quickly. The father didn't answer yet. He simply helped his daughter sit back at their table before turning his eyes once again to the attackers, making sure they stayed down. The restaurant remained in shock, unable to believe what they had seen. But one thing was clear to everyone in that room: the balance of power had shifted completely. The CEO, who had been seconds away from humiliation, now looked at the father with something more than gratitude. He looked at him with respect, maybe even awe. And though no one yet knew the full story of this man's hidden skill, they all understood that in just a handful of seconds, he had changed everything. The waiters began whispering to each other, some already calling the police. Guests leaned closer to one another, murmuring about how unbelievable it was. The tension slowly gave way to relief, but the sense of amazement remained. The single dad placed his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder, as if reminding himself why he had acted at all. He didn't care about recognition, or applause, or even thanks. He cared only about keeping her safe. But unknowingly, he had become the hero of the night, and the story of what had just happened would soon spread far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The three men were still groaning on the floor, trying to catch their breath, but none of them could get back up. The sound of broken plates and rattled glasses still echoed through the restaurant, mixing with the whispers of stunned guests. It had all happened so fast that many people hadn't even realized the fight was already over. 4 seconds. That was all it took for the balance of power to flip. The single dad stood tall, his breathing calm, his eyes alert. He didn't look like a man who had just taken down 3 attackers. He looked steady, as if he had known exactly what he was doing the whole time. His daughter clung to his side now, her tiny hands wrapped tightly around his shirt. She wasn't scared anymore. She looked up at him with wide eyes full of pride. To her, he was always a hero, but now everyone else could see it too. The CEO slowly straightened his chair and stood. His hands were still trembling, and his suit was wrinkled from being yanked around. Just moments earlier, he had been completely helpless. Now, he looked at the father with a mixture of relief and amazement. How did you do that?" he whispered, his voice low, almost shaking. The dad didn't answer right away. He looked down at the men on the ground to make sure they weren't getting up again. His eyes scanned the room, checking every detail, his instincts still sharp. Only after he was sure there was no more danger did he let his shoulders relax slightly. The diners erupted into whispers. Some applauded softly, unsure if it was appropriate, while others gasped and shook their heads, still in disbelief. "Did you see that?" one man whispered loudly to his wife. "It was like watching a movie." Another diner shook his head. "No, it was too real. I couldn't even follow his moves." Phones were still recording, but now instead of fear, people wanted to capture proof of what they had just witnessed. They knew no one outside would believe the story without video. The CEO's business partners peeked out from behind the tables where they had taken cover. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide. They had abandoned their leader at the first sign of danger, and now they felt both ashamed and relieved. None of them had expected a stranger to step in. Police sirens faintly wailed in the distance, growing louder. Someone had already called, and the authorities were on their way. The single dad guided his daughter back to her chair gently, telling her softly, "Stay here, sweetheart. Daddy will take care of everything." She nodded and sat quietly, sipping her juice again as if trying to return to normal, though her eyes stayed glued to him. The attackers groaned louder as they tried to move, but the dad stepped closer, his presence alone enough to keep them down. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was powerful. Everyone in the room could see it, this was not the first time he had faced danger. He was too precise, too controlled, too calm. The CEO walked closer, brushing dust from his sleeves. "You saved me," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "If you hadn't been here, his words trailed off. He couldn't bring himself to imagine what might have happened. He looked around the restaurant, then back at the dad. "Who are you?" he asked again, more firmly this time. The single dad met his gaze but stayed quiet for a moment. He didn't like attention. His life was about being unnoticed, just a hard-working father raising his little girl. Finally, he answered with simple words. "I'm just a dad." The CEO frowned, unsatisfied with the answer. He could tell there was more, but the father's tone made it clear he wasn't eager to share. The crowd, however, buzzed louder. Some said he must be a soldier, others whispered about him being an undercover guard. The mystery only made the story grow more powerful. The police finally arrived, rushing inside with firm steps. The waiters quickly pointed toward the 3 men on the floor. Officers restrained them, cuffing their wrists and pulling them to their feet. The attackers didn't resist. They were too sore, too shocked, too humiliated by how quickly they had been defeated. One officer glanced at the single dad and then at the CEO. Who stopped them? He asked. The CEO pointed toward the father without hesitation. The officer raised his eyebrows in surprise. He looked the dad up and down, not seeing a fighter, only a calm man holding his daughter's hand. Still, the respect in his eyes was clear. "You did good," he said simply before leading the attackers out of the restaurant. Once the danger was gone, the room released a collective breath. Guests started clapping, some standing to give him a round of applause. The sound filled the restaurant, bouncing off the walls. The single dad didn't bask in it. He simply nodded politely and guided his daughter closer, whispering to her again. The CEO, however, couldn't let it go. He stepped closer and said, "I don't know your story, but you deserve more than applause. You saved my life, and I won't forget this." He extended his hand. The father hesitated for a second before shaking it firmly. His grip was strong but respectful. The daughter tugged on his sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, can we go home now?" He smiled down at her. "Yes, baby. We'll go soon." She leaned against him, her eyes heavy but calm now that everything was safe again. The CEO's voice lowered as he said, "You're more than just a father. I can see it. Maybe you don't want the world to know, but people like you shouldn't stay in the shadows." The dad only shook his head slightly. "All I want is a good life for her," he said, nodding toward his daughter. "That's all that matters to me." The CEO didn't press further, but his eyes lingered with deep respect. He had seen many powerful people in his life, men with titles and wealth, but tonight, he had met someone different, a man with no spotlight, no riches, but a strength that couldn't be bought. The guests slowly returned to their meals, though the excitement still lingered. Conversations buzzed with retellings of what they had seen. Waiters moved about again, trying to restore order, though their eyes kept darting back to the father as if he were something unreal. The little girl, now calmer, leaned her head against her father's arm. He brushed her hair gently, his focus back on her as though the entire event had already been put behind him. But for everyone else in that restaurant, the memory of those 4 seconds would never fade. The CEO returned to his seat, but he couldn't stop glancing back at the father. Gratitude filled him, but also a deep curiosity. Who was this man really? He promised himself that he would find out. The night ended with police cars outside, the attackers taken away, and the restaurant buzzing with life again. But the story of what had just happened would travel far beyond those walls. For now, though, the single dad remained exactly who he wanted to be, just a father with his daughter, quietly finishing their meal, holding on to the peace he had fought to protect. And while the world would remember the hero who saved the CEO in seconds, he only wanted one thing: to go home with his little girl and tuck her safely into bed. The restaurant had slowly returned to its rhythm, but the air still carried a spark of energy. Guests leaned across tables whispering, retelling the unbelievable 4 seconds they had just witnessed. Some scrolled through their phones, watching the videos they had captured, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others glanced again at the quiet man who now sat calmly with his daughter, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The CEO had returned to his table, but his eyes kept drifting back to the father. He couldn't let it go. A few minutes ago, he had been helpless, surrounded by danger, and this stranger, this single dad, had stepped in and changed everything. It was not just the speed, not just the skill. It was the calmness, the control, the way he had never looked afraid. It was something the CEO, a man used to being in charge, had never seen before. The little girl, though still holding her father's sleeve, was smiling again. She whispered excitedly, "Daddy, everyone's looking at you." Her father smiled softly and replied, "They'll forget by tomorrow. What matters is that we're safe." She tilted her head. "But I won't forget," she said with the simple honesty only a child could have. He brushed her hair back gently, his heart warmed by her words. The waiters, who had been frightened during the chaos, now moved with a new sense of admiration. They refilled glasses, cleared tables, and occasionally whispered among themselves, sneaking glances at the father. One of them finally came over, leaning slightly as he said, "Sir, I just wanted to thank you. If you hadn't been here, I don't know what would have happened." The father only nodded humbly. "I did what anyone should do," he replied. But the waiter shook his head. "No, sir. Not anyone could have done that." Soon after, the police returned briefly to take statements. The CEO explained what had happened, pointing again toward the father as the one who had stopped it all. An officer asked him for his name. He hesitated for a moment before giving it quietly, not wanting the attention. The officer nodded respectfully and said, "You've got good instincts. We'll be in touch if we need more details." Then the officers left, taking the last traces of danger with them. The CEO finally stood and walked to the father's table. His voice was steady now, though softer than before. "I owe you more than words," he said. The father looked up, calm as ever. "You don't owe me anything," he replied. "I just did what had to be done." But the CEO shook his head. "You saved my life. Men like me, we sit in offices, we sign papers, we think we control everything. Tonight, I realized how powerless I can be. And I realized how much strength can hide in someone who isn't even trying to be noticed." The daughter listened carefully, her eyes flicking between the two men. She didn't fully understand the weight of the CEO's words, but she felt proud. The CEO reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a business card, and placed it gently on the table. "If you ever need anything at all, call me. People like you deserve opportunities, and I want to make sure you and your daughter never struggle." The father looked at the card for a moment but didn't pick it up. His hand stayed on the table beside his daughter's small fingers. "Thank you," he said politely, "but we're doing all right." He didn't want favors. He didn't want connections. All he wanted was a normal life for his child. The CEO studied him closely and then smiled slightly. "I believe you. But still, I want you to have it. Sometimes life opens doors when you least expect it." He tapped the card gently and stepped back. The father gave a small nod of respect, not agreeing, not refusing, just acknowledging. The restaurant guests clapped again quietly as the CEO returned to his seat. The story of the night was already spreading beyond the walls. Videos were being uploaded online, messages were being shared. People in that room knew they would tell the tale for years, the night when 3 men attacked a CEO in a restaurant, and a quiet single dad stopped it in just 4 seconds. But for the father, none of that mattered. He turned to his daughter and asked, "Did you enjoy your dinner?" She nodded quickly, her smile bright again. "Yes, Daddy. But I think what you did was better than the food." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Food is easier, sweetheart. Tonight was just something I had to do." She hugged his arm tightly. "You're the best daddy in the world," she whispered. As the night drew to a close, the father paid the bill and helped his daughter with her coat. The CEO stood once more, watching them quietly as they left. For all his power and wealth, he knew he had seen something rare that evening, a man who carried strength without showing it off, who lived not for himself but for his child, and who stepped into danger without hesitation when others froze. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around them. The city lights glowed, and cars passed by, unaware of the story that had just unfolded inside the restaurant. The father held his daughter's hand as they walked down the street together. She swung her arm playfully, her laughter returning. To her, the night was now a memory she would keep forever, not because of the fear, but because of the way her father stood tall when everyone else was afraid. The CEO remained inside the restaurant, sitting quietly at his table. His partners tried to speak about business again, but he waved them off. His thoughts lingered on the man who had just walked away. He realized that leadership was not always about titles or money. Sometimes, it was about courage, selflessness, and love. He promised himself that he would never forget that lesson. The videos of the event spread quickly the next day. People online argued about who the father might be. Some called him a hero, others speculated he was a former soldier or a fighter. But the man himself ignored it all. He cooked breakfast for his daughter, walked her to school, and went to work like any other day. His life was not about fame or recognition. It was about the small moments, the simple joys, and the quiet strength of raising his child. The world had been impressed by what he did in 4 seconds. But his daughter already knew the truth. Her father was her hero long before that night, and he always would be.